All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're stepping into an alternate reality, really, to explore a huge what if. What if one of the most transformative figures of our time just never existed? Let's dive right in. Now, this isn't just about, hitting a delete button on one guy's life. The real question here, the one we're really digging into, is so much deeper. Was history just waiting for someone like him? Was it inevitable? Or would his absence have sent the modern world spinning down a totally different path? This is really a test, right? The great man versus the forces of history. So, to even begin to imagine a world without Donald Trump, we have to flip the script. We first have to understand the world that made him. I mean, he didn't just appear out of thin air, right? He was a product of his time, and his story, well, it starts way, way before he ever thought about running for president. And the timing, wow, the timing is everything. He was born in 1946. Think about that. The absolute dawn of the post-World War II American century. This was an America at the very peak of its power. I'm talking economically dominant, culturally brimming with confidence, a nation built on this deep, unshakable belief in growth and hierarchy. This was the world that shaped him, a place where success wasn't just something you achieved, it was who you were. His true origin story, if you really look at it, it wasn't political at all. It was pure theater. He had this incredible, almost instinctual grasp of a simple idea: perception often matters a whole lot more than substance. He was basically building a personal brand before that was even a thing most people talked about. And long before social media algorithms started rewarding outrage, Trump had already cracked the code on the old school systems. I mean, he figured it out. He learned how to cultivate the tabloids, how to use TV appearances, not just for an interview, but to build a character. And yeah, how to stage these controversies that would keep his name plastered everywhere. In a world without him, sure, this mix of business and entertainment would still be there, but it'd be missing its most famous pioneer, for sure. But here's what's absolutely crucial to understand. Trump didn't create the anger and the division that would later propel him to power. He was shaped by it, and boy, did he learn how to tap into it. The fuel for the fire, as you're about to see, had been gathering for decades. So just look at this timeline. It really shows the slow-motion erosion of that post-war American confidence. First, you have celebrity culture starting to blur the lines between who's famous and who has authority. Then, boom, the 2008 financial crisis. That was a seismic event that just shattered public trust. And then, just a couple of years later, you see the Tea Party movement, which proved that a huge chunk of the country was absolutely starving for an anti-establishment voice. Let's just park on 2008 for a second, because you really can't overstate what a profound psychological turning point that was. I mean, imagine it. People watched as the big banks got bailed out by the government, while at the same time, their own homes were being foreclosed on, their jobs were disappearing, their savings gone. This created this deep, simmering anger that wasn't about left or right. It was this widespread feeling of being totally abandoned by the very systems that were supposed to be there to protect them. Okay, so in this atmosphere of just total distrust, the Republican Party of the early 2010s was facing a pretty serious identity crisis, let's be honest. Its traditional conservative message just wasn't landing with working-class voters who felt completely left behind. So you had a major political party that was searching for a new voice, a new direction, and that left a power vacuum wide open for someone to fill. And right at the same time, the entire media landscape was transforming. News organizations, from cable to online, were learning a very powerful and maybe a very dangerous lesson. Conflict generates clicks. Outrage drives ratings. Spectacle? Well, spectacle sells. This created an entire incentive structure that rewarded the loudest, most controversial voices in the room. The stage wasn't just set. The whole theater was being redesigned to favor a performer exactly like Trump. And that brings us to the absolute heart of our whole thought experiment, the 2016 presidential election. This is the moment. This is the fork in the road where our alternate timeline splits from our own. It's the point where the absence of one single person changes pretty much everything that comes after. So in our timeline, what did we get? A cultural shockwave. In the alternate path, the one without him, the Republican primary is still a fight. Think Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio. But it's a conventional political fight. The general election is tense, for sure, but it's a battle over policy and ideology, not this fundamental knockdown, drag-out fight over the very nature of politics itself. And that was the real change, wasn't it? His campaign didn't just attack his opponent, it completely rewired what voters expected from politics. It reframed the whole thing as pure confrontational entertainment. He said things that would have been an absolute career ender for any other politician, and by doing that, he normalized a totally new kind of political language. Without him, that shift, it just doesn't happen. At least not like that. Not that fast. And his absence wouldn't just be felt here at home, not by a long shot. The entire tone, the whole temperature of global politics would be profoundly different. Look, the core issues, they wouldn't just vanish. Trade disputes with China, debates over NATO funding, those big, long-term trends would still be there. Of course they would. But without Trump, they'd be handled through these slow, traditional, bureaucratic channels, not through public shouting matches on a global stage. The uncertainty would still exist, but it would feel less chaotic, less personal. And what about social media? His unique, relentless use of Twitter, it literally transformed the platform into a global nerve center. It was a direct line from a world leader that was both a political weapon and a primary news source all at once. Without him, political debate online is way more fragmented. Yeah, the extremes are still amplified, but the entire conversation doesn't just revolve around the daily tweets from one single account. He became more than just a politician. He became a symbol. He was like this giant projection screen for the hopes of his supporters and the fears of his critics. Without that one single polarizing figure to rally around or rally against, the cultural conflicts over identity, race, and immigration, they still exist, of course they do. But they're more diffuse. The fire is still there, but the massive explosion, that gets delayed. But this leads us to the most important, and maybe the most unsettling conclusion of this entire exercise. A world without Trump is not a world without problems. Not even close. The underlying pressures that created the conditions for his rise are still there, bubbling under the surface. And the perfect metaphor to describe his role in all this history is this. He wasn't the fire itself. He was the accelerant. Think of it like that. He was the substance that gets poured onto the smoldering embers of division, causing them to just erupt into a much larger, hotter, and faster spreading fire. And here they are. These are those smoldering embers. These are the deep, powerful forces pushing and pulling on our society. And removing the accelerant, that doesn't put out the fire. Economic inequality, the disruption of jobs from new technology, the anxieties over demographic change, and that deep, deep distrust in our institutions, all of these would still be pushing society towards some kind of breaking point. So in this quieter alternate timeline, that vacuum of leadership and that deep well of public anger, they still exist. And if history teaches us anything, it's that vacuums don't stay empty for long. Sooner or later, another figure would likely emerge to tap into that exact same energy. Maybe someone less theatrical, sure, but perhaps more disciplined, more ideological, and in their own way, potentially even more effective. So, what does this alternate world really look like? Well, on the surface, it's definitely calmer. The daily noise is turned way down. Politics is probably less of an all-consuming 24/7 obsession. But just beneath that quieter surface, the same institutional fragility, the same social strains, they just continue to build. Because again, he was an expression of those strains, not their ultimate cause. And that leaves us with the final, and maybe the most important question of this whole explainer. If the underlying forces of history are this powerful, then just removing one person from the equation might only change the timeline, not the final destination. The pressures that created the world we know, they're still there, building silently in this alternate reality. And you have to wonder, who steps onto the stage next? And what happens when they do?